Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, especially on a gorgeous evening like this. You can't find a better way to spend your time, so you've chosen well, but it's really lovely to see you here. It's also wonderful to see so many familiar faces and also familiar names up in the Zoom room. Some of our Zoomers, by the way, are joining us from Italy, where it is 11:30 rather than 5:30. So I'm very impressed with their eagerness to talk about and listen to Ron's lecture about Dante this evening. My name is Angela Alima O'Donnell. I'm the Associate Director of the Curran Center for American Catholic Studies, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for this evening, distinguished playwright, better for those of you on Zoom. Can you hear us now? Okay, great. Sorry. It seems as though okay. Can I ask everyone to mute themselves, everyone who's on Zoom, because we're getting some feedback here in the room. Just mute yourself in the left-hand corner of your screen. There should be a little microphone, and if you just click on that, it will exit out. Great. Thank you. All right, my apologies for the technical difficulties. I'll just briefly recap what I was starting to say earlier about Fordham Reads Dante. The Fordham Reads Dante project is an initiative that started a number of years ago when the Curran Center spent 18 months reading the whole of Dante's Commedia with the faculty and staff in our faculty seminar. And among our participants was Fordham's resident Dante scholar, Professor Susanna Barcella. Upon concluding our year and a half together with Dante, Professor Barcella suggested that we join in partnership, and along with the Department of Modern Languages and Medieval Studies program, we, the Curran Center, created Fordham Reads Dante, an opportunity for members of the Fordham community and also those beyond to gather each month of the academic year to read Dante's Commedia one canto at a time. In our meetings, we listen to the poetry of Dante in the original Italian read by a native speaker. We listen to it in an English translation. We hear a brief introduction to the canto presented by a distinguished scholar and or faculty member, and we engage in discussion. This conversation began in the spring of 2016, and with the exception of the COVID year, 2020, it has been going on ever since. As you can likely tell, we're not in any hurry. In proceeding at the luxuriously leisurely pace of one canto per meeting, members of the group are able to consider carefully the artistry of the Commedia, to savor the music of Dante's language and lines, and to better understand not only what the poem means, but how the poem means. Given this leisurely pace, and given the fact that the Commedia consists of 100 cantos, we will be at this for a while. After 6 years of gatherings, we have just completed Canto 26 in the spring of Inferno. So by my reckoning, we have another 74 cantos to go, about 12 years. So any of you who may want to join us, there's plenty of time for you. Our hope is that we're still alive to be able to continue, but even if we can't, we're hoping that others will take up the slack and go onward. And we are very patient people also. Dante was not in a hurry in writing his 14,233 lines of Terza Rima, so we are not going to be in a hurry reading them. From the beginning of the project, our focus has been on hearing Dante, to recreate orally the original sound of the poem. For poetry is first an oral art. It is linguistic music. In addition, we're interested in the ways in which Dante's work continues to speak to us here and now in the 21st century. 7 centuries after his death, Dante continued. Those of you who are on Zoom, please feel free to let us know when you're not hearing, and we will do our best to restore the microphone. It seems to be problematic this evening. Dante has influenced many artists, from painters to poets to novelists.
The sound isn't working again.
How's that? Is it working now? Yeah, I really don't know why this battery is, fritzing in and out. Okay. Okay, thank you. Sorry again that you all missed part of that. Happily, we have IT help coming, and they're going to bring us a microphone that actually will continue.
Yeah, it's off again.
If anything can go wrong, it will, and it has. Okay, it's working for this particular moment. So I'm going to try this once again while we're waiting for our new microphone. Ronald Jenkins is a professor of theater at Wesleyan University. He has continued his Dante prison projects as a 2020. I think I may just wait until Ronnie gets here with that. My apologies, Ron. I really, your introduction is really not. Most important thing is that we have it working for the presentation. So I imagine we will have one that is live for that. And I'm going to begin in medias res, rather than starting from the beginning with my introduction of our speaker this evening. Our annual Dante lecture is an event held in the fall, which kicks off our new year of Fordham Reads Dante gatherings. This year's speaker brings us a fresh new way, not only of hearing Dante's poem, but of seeing the ways in which the powerful drama of the Divine Comedy helps us to see the drama of our own lives. Ronald Jenkins has facilitated theater workshops inspired by Dante's poetry in prisons, both in Italy and in the United States, with support from the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights, the Asian Cultural Council, and the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center. A recipient of Guggenheim and Fulbright fellowships, Jenkins has written books focused on theater and social justice. His articles have appeared in such journals and newspapers as the New York Times, the Jakarta Post, and the Yale ISM Review. In addition, Mr. Jenkins has translated and directed plays by the Nobel laureate Dario Fo for productions for the Yale Repertory Theater, American Repertory Theater at Harvard University, and the New York Theater Workshop. His documentary plays have been commissioned by the Mellon Foundation, the U.S. State Department, the Massachusetts Foundation of the Humanities, and the New York Foundation of the Arts. A professor of theater at Wesleyan University, Mr. Jenkins has continued his Dante prison projects as a 2022-2023 fellow at the Yale Divinity School's Institute of Sacred Music, where he has been teaching courses on Dante since 2015. Mr. Jenkins is also an honorary fellow of the Dante Society of America. In his essay entitled Transformation Behind Bars, Ronald Jenkins testifies to the powerful effect Dante's words have on the incarcerated men and women he has worked with. Quote, "I've spent much of the last decade listening to incarcerated individuals read and reimagine Dante's Divine Comedy in prisons, from New York's fabled Sing Sing to Indonesia's notorious Carabocan jail to the Soliciano prison in Dante's hometown of Florence. The men and women I meet in prison temporarily forget where they are and when they immerse themselves in Dante's poem. The medieval epic inspires them to write about their own voyages from past hells to future heavens. People behind bars identify with Dante for the same reason that anyone might who takes the time to reflect on the poem. Many of us aspire to escape from our own dark forests to better places. In prison, that need is more urgent." Mr. Jenkins also tells this story in his essay. While imprisoned at Auschwitz on a particularly dark day, Italian writer Primo Levi was struggling to remember the noble words Ulysses speaks in Dante's Divine Comedy. When the words finally come to him, he is overcome with emotion. Dante writes, "Remember your birthright. You were not made to live like brutes, but to pursue wisdom and virtue." Primo Levi recalls the moment like a blast of a trumpet, like the voice of God. "For a moment, I forget who I am and where I am." This is the gift and grace Dante's poem gives to his readers, and this is the gift and grace Ron Jenkins offers by bringing Dante into prisons and making his expansive and hopeful vision available to men and women who live there. This evening, we'll get to hear about this unique and powerful work Mr. Jenkins does. We are very fortunate to have him with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Ronald Jenkins to Fordham.
Thank you, Angela, and for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Susanna in Italy for initiating the whole event, and thanks to Ronnie and Faustino and Maria for all the technical support. I guess I'd like to start out by asking a very personal question that you don't have to answer by raising your hand if you don't want to, but I really would like to know if, by raising your hands, if any of you have been in prison or worked in prisons or taught in prisons or have a family member or a close friend who's been in prison. Okay. Good, a few, yes. For those of you who have that connection to the justice system, and for everybody else, of course, it will be different if you haven't had that connection. But I'd like you to try to imagine what it might be like, what it might be like to be in prison reading Dante's Divine Comedy, to be in prison reading a story about a man taking a voyage through hell on his way out. Try to think about that and what it would be like. It's almost impossible to imagine if you haven't spent time in prison, and even difficult if you have spent a little time, because most of the men and women that I've worked with in prison are there for a long time. I work in maximum security prisons, so sometimes they've been in for decades, and sometimes they have no hope of ever leaving. You know, one man I remember in particular, he was born when his mother was in prison, so he was actually born in prison, and he now has a sentence of 999 years, so he expects to die in prison. But even he had really profound things to say about Dante when he read it, and it was really important for him to read. But as you try to imagine that, I'm going to present the words of some of the men and women who I've met in prison reading Dante, and I apologize for reading, but I really want to read their words so you hear from them directly about what it meant to be reading Dante in prison. And I'll start with a story about two men who were in a maximum security prison that I met about 5 years ago. And happily, they're both out of prison now. But 5 years ago, they had been in for a while. One of the men's name is Vernal. And in the fall of 2018, he was in a maximum security prison in Connecticut. And he was working as a nurse's aide in the hospital there in the prison. And one of the men on his unit was Robert. And Robert had been removed from the prison's general population after suffering a heart attack, during which time his heart had stopped and had to be resuscitated. And the doctors told him he had less than a year to live. Robert was despondent on hearing that news, and he spent most of his time sleeping. And one day, Vernal, the nurse on the ward, came to his bed and kicked the bed and woke him up. Now, for people in prison, that's one thing you never do. That's taboo. Never wake anybody up. Because in prison, sleep is one of the only ways to escape the cruelty of being in prison. And Robert especially, he would tell me that when he would sleep and dream, he would feel like that was his reality. And when he woke up, that was the nightmare of his dream. So he really didn't want to be woken up, and that's one of the reasons he slept so much. But Vernal did wake him up, and he said, "Read this." When he woke up, read this, and he was pointing to a photocopy excerpt of a canto from Dante's Inferno. He said, "Read this, see yourself. Isn't this just like you? Isn't this just like us? Dante got kicked out of his country. We got kicked out of ours. Dante lost love. We lost love too. Read it." And Vernal was trying to convince Robert to enroll in the Dante workshop that I was teaching that was about to begin, because Vernal had taken that workshop the year before, and he thought it would be important for Robert to take it too. So why would men spending decades in prison decide it was important for them to read the Divine Comedy? As Angela said, I've been listening to men respond to Dante for about 12 years in Italy, Indonesia, and the US. And I'll try to answer that question for you, why it meant something to them by reading their words. So, and happily, Robert and Vernal were able to share these words with me and my students 5 years later, because now they're out of prison and they've been coming to the Yale Divinity School to meet with my students and talk to them about what it meant to read Dante in prison. And Vernal said this: "I knew how much Dante had changed me, It gave me a chance to feel how to put down on paper how I feel. It made me feel strong. If I had taken a Dante class a long time ago, I would never have gone to prison. The news from Robert's doctor broke his spirit. He was scared to die. He cried. I wanted him to read Dante, to see himself there and write about it. In prison, people think you're weak if you talk about your feelings. But when I wrote about how I felt and put it in verse next to Dante's words, it made me feel strong. I thought it would help Robert do the same thing and told him he had to take the class. And just so you know, the class is structured so that we read Dante and then the men or the women in prison respond by writing their own versions of their own journeys out of their own hells towards a better place. So they're reimagining Dante's journey from their own point of view. Robert, who was in bed the day that Vernal woke him up, remembered it vividly, and he told my class this. He said, I was going through a lot at the time. I had died. My heart had stopped. The doctor said, your heart is weak. You're not going to make it past this year. I was breaking on the inside. Mentally, I wasn't in the right space. My psyche was all scrambled, and that was the moment when Vernal motivated me, kicked my bed, and did everything to get me out of bed because I was carrying a big burden that was almost destroying me. So when he brought me to the Dante class, that gave me a chance to, press the release valve. I related to Dante. My life, is like Dante's story. I'm living it right now. I was living it when I was in prison, and I'm still living it. Remember, he's saying this after he's come out of prison. Dante's Inferno opened my eyes, not in a physical sense. It opened my eyes spiritually. The story was so powerful. I gravitated to it. I had no choice but to gravitate to it because the magnetic power from Dante was it was strong, like a current in the ocean. Robert talked about Dante's magnetic pull and how it had impact on the other men in the prison workshop, who were usually segregated from one another, but somehow people from different gangs and different ethnic groups who usually don't mix in prison all came together in that Dante workshop. And here's how Robert described it. Different cultures came together. You had a Hell's Angels biker who'd been in for 26, 27 years. Then you had a Spanish dude who just lost his mother. He had to hold back the tears. He felt the power of Dante. They all felt it in different ways. I was really inspired by the way others perceived Dante. I felt their stories just as they felt mine. They touched me. It opened up something inside of me. I'm not perjuring you, it's real. And when he said real, that in prison is one of the best compliments you can get. At the end of the semester, the men present their stories interwoven with quotes from Dante to the prison audience. And you can imagine what that's like, kind of pouring your heart out and reading medieval poetry to an audience of men who are in a maximum security prison with, a lot of tattoos, a lot of muscles, guys that are not, ordinarily fans of poetry. But when they heard these stories, you could see these tough guys crying because they were so moved. And afterwards, the men told me that the best compliment they received, they kept hearing men would say, that was real. That was real. Because in prison, people are always making things up, and not everything is real. But when they heard Dante's words and the stories that went with them, they said that was real. And like many other incarcerated readers I've met over the years in Italy, Indonesia, and the US, Vernal and Robert identified with Dante as someone who, like them, had been convicted of crimes and forced to live in exile away from his family. So there's that personal point of connection. I remember in the performances in prison, usually the audience, again, they've come to hear Dante. They don't even know who Dante is, but somehow they all want an excuse to get out of their cells. So they'll come to the performance just to get out, but they're not really interested in Dante, and the guards are trying to quiet them down, and they're making noise, and you wonder how will we get them to pay attention. But when I tell them that you're going to hear about Dante, who was convicted of crimes he didn't commit and sentenced to death, because Dante was actually writing under a death sentence. If he ever went back to Florence, he would have been burned at the stake. So then the men in prison pay attention. That makes Dante real to them. They identified with somebody like Dante who'd been convicted of crimes. And Vernal said this white dude back in, because both of these men are African-American, as are most men and women in prison, as you probably know, are people of color. A large percentage of men and women in prison are people of color, as Robert and Vernal were. But Vernal says this white dude back in 12 or 1300s lived our life way before we lived it. And he felt that one line was particularly relevant to the experience of incarceration. Passage from Canto 26. I didn't know that in your journey through Dante, you were on Canto 26, which is where the title of my talk comes from. And we were not born to live like brutes, but to follow virtue and knowledge. You were not born, says Ulysses to the men on his ship. And that line, I chose that as the title for this talk because that's particularly potent for the men and women in prison. They usually choose one line that will be the theme of their writings, and that's the one that many men and women gravitate to because they feel like they're living like beasts or brutes. When we translate, we often say you're not meant to live like beasts because they feel that in prison they're being treated like beasts, like animals. In fact, I remember once going into the prison and one of the guards said to me on my way in, "We'll be sure not to feed the animals." And that was his little joke, but it really reflected the way he felt about the men that he was guarding in the prison. That line, "You were not meant to live like beasts, but to follow virtue and knowledge," that line was about us, Vernal said. And it inspired him to write a rap about waking up Robert to read Dante. So I'll read to you, unfortunately, I'm not a rapper, but I'll read to you what Vernal wrote about, because he remembered very vividly that time that he had to wake Robert up. And he wrote this rap about it. "We weren't meant to live like beasts, but we chose that lifestyle and adapted to it. We weren't meant to live that way, to live the way we lived, and we had an uneasy spirit. I told him infernos about a man's journey into the underworld, agony and misery. The devil's playground, it's not hard to tell. Dante's journey was going in, but we were born in hell. Read it." So I kicked his bed and was ready to run. I quoted Dante, "Where did we go wrong? Did it start from the household or the slave ships of old? Because we become so disrespectful and neglectful, gang bangers and drug slangers, unpaid hired assassins. What happened to love and compassion? Our lust has become disgust, and we were willing to bleed for greed. I told Robert to read." I'll stop there, it's longer, but Vernal's raps will have more impact if you actually hear him speak them. And I don't have a recording of Vernal doing that rap, but I do have a recording, a rare recording, because usually we're not allowed to bring recording equipment into prison. But one year, the year before this, NPR did a feature about the project, and they let us bring in a recording equipment for the radio station. So I'll play for you an excerpt of Vernal and some of the other men talking about Dante and what it meant to them. In this session, I came in with my Yale. Sometimes I go into prisons myself, and sometimes I bring in the students. And this year, I brought in my Yale Divinity School students. So you'll hear them singing because in the performances, the students back up and support the men in their performance any way they can. And this year, the Yale students were pretty good singers, so they sang as a backup to the men, Regina Caeli, one of the chants that Dante refers to in Paradise. So they were singing Regina Caeli in the background, and you'll hear them in the background as Regina Caeli, the Queen of Heaven, as you hear Vernal and the other men talking. So Faustino, can you play that audio?
My father left me at an early age, sending me in an early rage. Some of the reasons why I'm in this cage. And you telling me God knew all this? This was preordained? You mean this was staged? What, he's the author and I'm some character in this book and he's just turning the page? Sins of the father. When I was out in the world, I was so godless. About my crime, found guilty on all charges. I just hung my head low, and my mother took it the hardest. Now I'm in prison, hoping my young daughter don't get locked up. Because she's looking for love in all the wrong places. Hell, daddy's not there. Daddy's locked up. Sins of the father. My son talking about he want a gangbang. He's a minor older guys on the corner selling that cane. He hate cops now. Pow! He want to carry that thing. Sins of the father. I only got myself to blame. My kid's mother I no longer see. She be like, oh, he's just a memory that used to mean so much to me. Living in drug-infested areas, kids' clothes ripped and dirty, face snot nose, cars not registered, street full of potholes. My kids live in a hard-knock lifestyle, and you can see it in their eyes. Growing up on fast food restaurants, Chinese chicken and some McDonald's french fries. Sins of the father.
Me and Dante can relate because hard experience in life, like bad troubles in my time that led me to a deeper tunnel and obstacle, just like he went through in the poem. And it made me realize that sometimes you gotta look at the signs and try to change your way instead of fixing what you can't fix. Just start up something new. And with that, I could relate with him. So it's like I know exactly what he's going through at the time. So
who was the guy that you chose to lead you?
I chose Malcolm X because he come from New York City just like I did, but it's just not where he came from. His life experience. He went to jail just like I'm in jail, and he taught himself, you know what I'm saying, in jail, because he didn't have the proper guidance when he was home. So he had good brothers that was telling him what to do and how to do things in jail, and because of that, I can relate to him because I got older gentlemen that's teaching me in here how to educate myself.
Did you ever make a connection between the things that Dante says and what's written on your neck?
Yeah, you can't fix your past, you know what I'm saying? All you can do is play how it is, and that's what I got on my neck, and I believe in that quote. So it's like a poker game, you know. If you get a hand that's dealt to you and you know you got a bad hand, don't be quick to fold it because they don't got nothing either. So play how it is, you know, take your chance. Sometimes you got to take chances.
And what is it that's written on your neck?
I'm not afraid of death. It's the stake that won't put up in order to play the game of life.
Is this justice or is this just ice? Only one who has knowledge of self can serve justice. Justice the reward and ice is the penalty. When one is penalized, he or she is served with just ice, meaning to be frozen in a mental state of 32 degrees below zero. Is this justice or is this just us? Because of the color of my skin, I'm a usual suspect. My nice clothes and jewelry, a drug dealer is what some suggest. If I defend my haven or my home, gang violence is what they suspect. They lock us down for years and use us as test subjects. Is this justice or is it just ice? See, I live in a state of commonwealth, where the rich get rich and the poor get poor, and everyone is for himself, where individuals get envious of your wealth, and you receive decades or centuries for trying to defend yourself. Is this justice or is it just us? It's just this. Society prepares a crime and the criminal commits the act. For me, justice is just I see equality, because I...
Okay. Could go on, but I wanted just to give you a taste of the men's voices themselves. speaking about it, and he talked about how Malcolm X was his guide. The men all chose their own guides, who would be their Virgil, who would be the guide that they would choose to lead them out of hell. And he chose Malcolm X. Other men chose Mother Teresa, Joan of Arc, Richard Pryor, all kinds of guides. Richard Pryor was because he thought he would need a few laughs on his way out of hell. And if we didn't get to that part, but actually at the end, you would have heard the Yale students singing the words, you were not made to live like brutes, but to follow virtue and knowledge. Fatti non foste a vivere come i bruti, ma per seguir virtute e conoscenza. They sang that to the tune of Regina Coeli. And that was the end of the presentation that day. And that quote, as I said, was important to the men. And it's also a quote that helps you understand that these men and women who read Dante in prison, Italy, Indonesia, US, they're part of a long line of incarcerated readers of Dante. Angela spoke about Primo Levi reading Dante in the concentration camp, and the one line, I forget if you got to that when you were quoting that story, but the line that he thought it was so important to remember and share with this new man who had just come into the concentration camp was that line. You were not meant to live like brutes, but to follow virtue and knowledge, because in the concentration camp, of course, they were living like animals. But somehow he felt that if you remembered those lines from Dante, that would help you preserve your humanity in some way. And that's often what the men and women in prison say. Yeah, when we read poetry, when we read Dante or other things, we feel like human beings. When you come in with students from Yale and we have a class, we feel like we're human, because we're so often treated like we're not human. That line encapsulates that frustration of being treated like animals. And that line is also a line that that's men and women in prison sometimes speak without having read Dante. I mean, if any of you know or have read about the Attica prison riot in the 70s, when the men in the prison were rebelling against the inhuman treatment of being in that prison, and they took over the prison. And in the prison yard, they wrote a manifesto, and they spoke that manifesto, and it was on national TV because this was a big event. The first words of the manifesto were, "We are men, not beasts." Almost a paraphrase of Dante, not having read Dante, but it makes you feel that Dante's poetry rhymes with the history of incarceration. And that line was, and it reminds me of another man in prison, who in the gulags in the Soviet Union, who also read Dante very deeply, Osip Mandelstam. And he wrote that when it is unthinkable to read the cantos of Dante without aiming them in the direction of the present day. They are missiles for capturing the future. And that's why people still read Dante today. And that's why men and women in prison who read it, I feel like they receive the missiles and understand those missiles for the future more deeply than most, because they have lived some of the exile that Dante lived through when he was writing the poem. Other men in prison who have read and written about Dante, for instance, is Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist who was put in prison for his political beliefs. And if you read his letters from prison, he talks about Dante. There's one letter that he writes to Tatiana, his sister-in-law, and he starts out the letter talking about his fever, and his fever, he's telling her, I had this really high fever and this, and then he stops And he says, but what I really want to write about is Dante. What I really want to write to you about is Dante. And then he goes on, because he's writing an essay about Canto 10, about where Dante meets Farinata and Cavalcante in hell. And Gramsci was almost obsessed with that canto, and he says, well, people always think that it's the canto of Cavalcante about Farinata, but for Gramsci, he said it's really about Cavalcante. That's who's really important in this canto, because Cavalcante is the one who's trying to get information about his son. And he's worried that, and there's this misunderstanding, and he thinks his son is dead, and he's devastated. And Gramsci says that's the part that is most important in that canto. And really, he's remembering his own son, who he's losing contact with because he's in prison. And that is one of the themes that also recurs every time we read Dante in prison. The men and the women always think about their children, especially when they read the canto about Ugolino. Ugolino, who is imprisoned with his children, and he has to watch his children die while they're all imprisoned together. And it has such a powerful effect on men and women in prison who read this, because they feel like their children are suffering. One man, Abdur, said this when he read that canto. He said, when I read about Ugolino's children starving in prison, I thought about my own children, starving for the love I could not give them all the years I was in prison. And that's just one example, but it's very emotional for men and women in prison to read that Ugolino chapter. And they write very profound things in response to it. Another man who wrote about his children, actually in an interesting way, was Patrick, who Robert referred to when he was saying how one of the men was a Hell's Angel. Patrick was the Hell's Angel he was referring to, who had a lot of tattoos, big muscular guy, and he had been in the Hell's Angels. Again, not the kind of person you would expect to really love Dante, but he was really moved. He wrote amazing responses to the poem. And he also brought out a poem that his daughter had written to him 10 years earlier. And he had kind of lost touch with his daughter, and he wrote about how he felt badly about that. And one of the Yale students was a singer and composer, and she took that poem and she composed a song with the words of that poem. And she sang it during the performance in the prison, and then during the performance at Yale, because what we do is after we have the performance in the prison, we have the same performance of the words written by the men or the women in prison, and we perform that at Yale. Unfortunately, the people in prison can't come to Yale, but their families come, and they listen to the Yale students perform the words of their mothers, brothers, husbands, wives, whatever. And they hear them in a new context. They're somehow hearing the words of their families who have been imprisoned at a university, and somehow those words are being respected and appreciated in a way that they're never appreciated anywhere else. And the daughter of Patrick was there that day when the Yale student sang the poem that she had written to her father 10 years earlier, and she didn't know that her father had even saved the poem. So she was afterwards in tears, and her mother was there in tears, and this was Patrick's mother. So Patrick's daughter and Patrick's mother were in the audience, and the mother said, I might have it written here what the mother said, but essentially it was that she said, "Thank you for presenting my son as something other than a monster, because all these years, anytime anybody refers to him, they refer to him as a monster, as a beast, but now you presented him as someone who is kind of a human being. Thank you so much for that. And that's the kind of transformation that goes on in these performances. Somehow the families, the men in prison are going through a process of transformation. They understand that Dante's poem is a poem about transformation, and they are, and then they want to somehow transform the audience's understanding of what prison is and who is in prison, so that the audience who has no experience with prison or no connection to the justice system hears these words written by men in prison, and they also begin to understand, oh, people in prison aren't necessarily monsters. You know, they have something worthwhile to say that's worthwhile to listen to. And in that particular performance, well, actually, let me let you hear the Yale students singing this song. So again, imagine yourself being the daughter and the mother of a man in prison, hearing his words from a poem that you've written to him 10 years ago that you didn't know that he saved.
Daddy says I have wings, but when will I fly? He tells me to use them, but how and why? I was born with the gifts of faith and strength. The world I will step into any day now will open like the sunrise. With my gifts, I will be able to fly through the night. Now I will spread my wings and fly with the angels. My daddy said to watch over me. Watch over me. Watch over me.
So that was the song of Patrick's daughter that had an impact on everybody in the audience, not just his family. And in that day, there was a man in the audience who was formerly incarcerated. Afterwards, we have conversations that are always give and take with the audience. And actually today, I'll leave some time for you to ask questions as well. But here, one of the men in the audience who was formerly incarcerated, didn't know us, we didn't know he would be there, said this after he heard the performance. He said, "Your perspective in life comes from the cage you were held captive in. I overcame addiction. That was one of my prisons. And there's also the prison of fear about moving forward, about losing your job, about getting a job, about housing. Just let them know," in other words, he was saying, let us know when we go back to the men who wrote these stories. Let them know that it really touched me, for my freedom was forged in me in that furnace of affliction. It created a tenacity in me. It was really powerful and moving for me to hear the way they wrote this out. There's so much talent behind those walls. Thank them from the bottom of my heart." And that's what many people in the audience go away feeling, that there's so much talent there. And Dante has this line that I always think about when I'm in the coming back from the prison every week. He said, this is what Dante says after meeting the men in limbo, the noble pagans. He says, "Gran duol mi prese al cor quando lo inteso, perché gente di molto valore erano in quel limbo sospesi. That great sadness possessed me when I realized that people of such worth and value were suspended in that limbo. And that's the feeling that I have every time I come out of prison, and it's the feeling that the audience has when they hear these stories. Not living that line, you were not meant to live like beasts, but to follow virtue and knowledge, has multiple meanings. You know, Dante in one of his letters wrote that his poem was polysemous, that you could interpret it in many ways. And one of the interpretations is that comes out of that line, but it's also present in other parts of the poem, is waking up to the light, coming out of the darkness into the light. Not living like a beast, but living like a human is coming out of darkness into light. Michel Foucault referred to prison as that darkest region in the apparatus of justice. And responding to the passage in Inferno where Dante is driven down to a place where the sun is silent, that's back in Canto 1, incarcerated readers of the poem make it clear they make clear connections between their situation and the metaphoric absence of light. This is a quote from one of the men that I taught in Sing Sing in 2010. And happily, he's out of prison now, and he's worked with us in some of these performances, but he still remembers that his encounter with Dante from 2010 as a turning point. He said, "I was tired of living in darkness, being in that hell. Like Dante, I knew I was going to have to face some demons, but I wanted to get to the light." Reflecting back on the workshop 10 years later, Woodbine says that reading Dante marked a turning point in his life behind bars. He continues. This is a quote from another man in that same class in Sing Sing in 2010, who also happily is out. He said, Dante talks about finding himself. Hell can be a physical place like prison or a state of mind. Your demons, your criminal lifestyle, that's hell too. If I didn't go to prison, I'd be dead. I needed to go into that darkness to get to the light. We open my clemency application with a line from Dante. And he quotes, "About halfway through the course of my pathetic life, I woke up. And when I say woke up, I mean that I started living up to my potential. The workshop on Dante sparked my life. It motivated me to come out of the darkness. 10 years ago, I was studying Dante's words in prison, and it was Dante's words in my clemency application that got me out of prison." So he was so taken by Dante that he quoted Dante in his clemency application, and it worked. He got out early. And that quote, the way he quoted it was from a translation by Sandow Burke, which is a kind of a modern translation. So, sometimes we look at different translations, so, more classic translations and more modern ones. And I'll go read you something else by Dario Fo from the Sing Sing, from that class in Sing Sing. When again, that first line means a lot. That first line when Dante says, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la dritta via era smarrita. Mi ritrovai, I found myself. I woke up. When Dante says he woke up and became aware in this first line, I said to myself, wow, because that's just what I'm going through. Once we started the workshop on Inferno, I fell in love with it. We were diverse, Italian, Black, Dominican, Jamaican, Puerto Rican. Listening to each other respond to Dante, we realized we were more similar than different. We were able to come out of our shells, performing our intimate thoughts and feelings, and being listened to without being judged was liberating for us. In prison, you're at the rock bottom of your life, but you still hope you can climb out of it and get to some kind of paradise. The whole text of Dante goes to teach you that all of life's journey is about self-realization and understanding who you are. That's the bottom line of Dante, the realization of yourself in the most perfect form of who you've always been, but lost sight of. Reading and performing Dante gave me perspective on my own transformation and let me see that heaven, hell, and purgatory can exist in prison or out of prison or in your own mind. And that insight about becoming the best person that you can possibly become as you go through this process of transformation, which they imagined Dante to be going through and they were trying to go through themselves, is embodied in one of the guides that one of the men in Sing Sing back in 2010 chose to lead him out of prison. I still remember it because he chose his guide to be Future X. And we all asked him, who's Future X? And he said, Future X is my future self, the best self that I could possibly become. And that's who I want to guide me out of this place. And I felt like he really understood Dante in a deep way to make that choice. I think that we've gone on a while, so maybe, let's see, maybe I'll let you see one more clip and then I'll ask you for, if you have any questions, and then we can talk some more. So let me just set up this, okay, this is, you're going to hear a woman who encountered Dante after she left prison, because during COVID, we couldn't go into prison anymore. So we began working with formerly incarcerated men and women. This woman had been in prison for 37 years. And every Sunday, she was a gospel singer, and every Sunday in church, in the prison church, she would sing. And when she was reading Dante with my students, every quote from Dante would remind her of a song that she used to sing in the prison chapel. So, and it was endless, and she's amazing. You're going to hear her sing now. But when we got to the part where at the beginning of Purgatorio, Virgil is explaining to Cato that the purpose of Dante's journey is searching for freedom. Libertava cercando. When she heard that, she said, oh yeah, of course, freedom means so much to men and women in prison. And she sang, that made her sing this song, and that you'll hear now. This is a recording that we did in a performance in Harlem. The students and this woman, Naomi Wilson, and one of the other, several of the formerly incarcerated individuals came to Harlem and did a show for an audience of people whose families had been in prison or had been impacted by the justice system. This is the song that she sang in response to that line, Libertava cercando. We can't hear it. We need the sound. Over me. Yeah. Freedom over me. Yeah. Freedom. Over me before I be a slave. I'd rather be buried somewhere in my grave than I'm going home to live. Hey, oh, So that's Naomi. After 37 years in prison, when she went in prison, her son was 10 years old, and when she came out, he was 47. So she's someone else who really responded to the Ugolino story. I think I'll stop with that because it's hard to follow Naomi's singing. Her friends would say that when she would sing in the prison chapel, everybody would come. You know, the atheists would come, the baby killers would come, the Satan worshipers would come. They would come just to hear Naomi sing. So I'll end now and ask you for any questions that you may have. Yes.
Sharing these wonderful experiences with us. What I would like to hear you talk about is how you handle the differences between the vulnerabilities of people you work with and the students who work with you. Did you have any conversation? Did you have any reflection? Did you have any sort of ongoing talk about that? Because obviously, students will definitely be well-meaning, but there's also a big imbalance and a big difference in the type of lives that the people in prison live and people who come to prison to work with them live.
Yes. So you mean the Yale students, how they respond to hearing the stories? It's tough. We have to
did the students also come to prison to teach, or did?
Yes. Well, sometimes I go myself, and sometimes the students come with me, and usually they pair up with one of the incarcerated. So one of the incarcerated students works together with one of the university students, and they work together as a team to create the story that they'll perform and the song that will go with it, and weaving Dante's quotes into the story. So, and they usually develop a really, really tight bond. And they, we become each other's Virgil. They teach something to the incarcerated student, and the incarcerated student teaches something to them. So it's a real back and forth. We don't feel like we're going into prison to teach the people there. It's a collaboration. So we're collaborating on reading Dante and responding to Dante together. It's tough. It's tough to especially, but we always talk about it afterwards, usually in the bus home. The hardest part is that we get to leave, but they don't. It brings up a lot of sadness in the students, but it also one of the things they learn about is how to be hopeful in a really despairing situation. It's amazing to me and to the students when they see the kind of the hopefulness and the spirit and the energy of men who are living in such awful conditions. You know, and one woman said every time she would leave the prison, she would go home and call her mother, because the men and women in prison can't call their mothers, you know, or maybe once a week or once a month they can. So it's an education about life, you know, especially for people in privileged universities like Yale and Wesleyan, where I teach. They learn something about the world that they may not have any connection to. But some of them do have connections to. Some of them have family members who've been in prison. So it's an opening up for everyone.
Sorry, just to complete that. Did you see any response from the people who are in prison that addressed directly the interaction with the students or with the group? Was it explicitly addressed in any follow-up or in the work they did?
Well, yes. Whenever we go back and talk to them, I guess one of the most profound things is that we see each other in each other. So the men and women in prison often say to the students, "Oh, you're just like me. You know, if I hadn't made the mistake that I had, or if I hadn't been born where I was born, you know, I would be like you. I would be in college doing this or that. They see themselves, and the students then see the people in prison. They say, "Oh, you're just like me." If I didn't have the privilege that I have, or if I grew up someplace else, I would be like you. So again, they don't see them as monsters. They see, "Oh, you're like me." And it's like Dante, when he went through hell, he saw himself in all the people that he met in hell. He saw, "Oh, there's I could have been you." He faints when he meets Francesca, because he sees that he had the capacity to overindulge in lust or whatever. He has the sympathy, and he's looking at a mirror in a way, and we all in the prison are looking in each other's mirrors and seeing ourselves in both directions. So that's, I think, the most profound response. I guess one of the other responses that often the men and women in prison talk about is how it feels to be listened to so deeply, because the students come back and they try to transcribe what they've heard in the session in the prison, and they come back and they perform the words that have been spoken or written by the men and women in prison, and they're astonished. They say, "Wow, they really listened to me. I don't even remember that I said that, but that sounds really cool, and that sounds worth listening to." And the fact that and these are men and women who are never listened to. They're totally ignored. They're erased from society, and suddenly somebody's listening and pay attention. It means a lot. And one man I remember in particular said, "Yeah, after that experience, now I listen to people more than I used to, because I see what an impact that it has." But they're just, examples. There are many, many more things are going on. It's all levels of transformation. It's like a chain reaction of transformations in the prison and in the university audience.
Thank you.
Yes.
In the prisons, it's more of an observation than a question. But the work that you're doing by bringing Dante's words to these prisoners reminds me of a scene in Shawshank Redemption, where the main character steals away into the room where the PA system is. And he puts on an opera record and plays an aria. And it puts a stop in everyone's mind and heart. The prisoners, including, but not so much the jail keepers, because they said, "How dare he?" But for the prisoners, it brings up this very beautiful experience of liberation and that vitality that is so essential. It seems that what you're doing is really bringing restorative justice and really making what prisons are, at least in principle, are supposed to be a reformatory. But even more than just reformatory, but also restoring. And that's where I think the justice system has to move in this country and perhaps globally. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with all of those. And as you say, the feeling of liberation is there. So often the men or the women say, when we perform these words, we feel like we're not in prison. That for that moment that I recite Dante or I sing or I perform, I feel free. And that means a lot, even to have those few seconds of freedom and to remember what freedom was like and hope for it.
Hi. To the incarcerated people in the prisons, did they have any favorite stories or parts or verses from the Purgatorio or the Paradiso that they related to and also talked about?
Oh, I'm glad that you asked that, because we always move out. We never want to leave them in Inferno. So we always go to Purgatory and Paradise. And we end with Paradise. That section about Cato and freedom is in Purgatorio. But in Paradise, one of the lines that really grabs men and women in prison is a line that's also connected to you were not born to live like brutes, but to follow virtue and knowledge, because that quote is really about the injustice of being treated like an animal. And in Paradise, Dante goes to the sphere of heaven dedicated to justice, and in the stars, written in light, in kind of a light show, in that sphere of justice, the stars write out the words "Diligite justitiam qui judicatis terram," respect justice, you who rule the world. It's almost like a demand that you who are in charge of the world, because Dante was writing about the corruption of politics in Florence and all over Italy and Europe, really. And the men in Florence, they loved that line, and and that became the theme of their piece, the motif that they repeated all the way through the show, and they had a gesture that went with it. So whenever they said that, they would say, "Diligite justitiam qui judicatis terram," and you sensed that they were kind of beating out the frustration of the injustice that they were living through. That really meant a lot to them. To let the world know that justice should be respected. And in most translations, that's translated as "love justice, you who rule the world." But in that sense, I felt like we had to translate it "respect justice," not just love it, respect it, because that's what they were demanding. And in the heaven of justice, those letters about respecting justice turn into the shape of an eagle. And the eagle becomes the representative of justice in heaven. But the men in Florence, the men actually all over, they have a different idea of justice. For them, it's not an eagle. They see justice, having been treated by justice like animals, they see justice differently. So one of the men would say, well, justice for me is like a chameleon, that changes shape according to who's being judged. The people who are less well off, then the chameleon takes a more evil shape. And if you're rich, then the chameleon of justice has a more benevolent shape. It's changing shape and color. And another man said, for me, justice is a billy goat that devours everything in its path and can often be found chewing on the US Constitution. Another man, actually, Dario Fo, who was sitting behind Naomi when she was singing, he said, for me, justice is a Komodo dragon because it eats its victims alive from the inside out. And that's how he felt he was being treated by justice. So thank you for that question. But yeah, paradise is important.
I have 3 more questions, 2 here and 1 in the chat. Would you prefer here?
Oh, I see. There's a question from the chat. Okay, let's hear a question.
I have 3 actually, 2 here, 2 people here, and 1 in the chat. You prefer all of them?
Let's start with the chat, so the people on Zoom don't feel left out.
So this is a question from one of the folks on Zoom today. Are there any specific parts of Dante that helped to heal bigotry and bring prisoners together who might have hated each other before?
Just the fact that they're all in the room together, as many of the men said who I quoted, made a big difference. They listen to each other in a way they never get a chance to listen to each other. Their responses to Dante, and then they feel like, I think Dario said that, then they realize they're not so different from each other as they thought, because their responses to Dante are the same. And one of the things that they all have in common that they realize when they're responding to Dante is the way they respond to that one of the most famous lines, abandon all hope, you who enter here over the gates to hell. And every, in Italy, Indonesia, everywhere, men, women, when they get to that part, they just don't accept it. They say, and they notice, Dante doesn't stop there. He doesn't give up hope. He goes right past the sign and he gets out of hell and gets to purgatory and heaven. So it's, for them, they don't identify with the people stuck in hell. They identify with the guy who's on his way out and up. One man in particular, I'll read to you what he, again, I feel like answering these questions with their words rather than mine, but he says, when he read that, this is a man who was in for more than 30 years. And when he came out, he went back into prison with a program called Hope Lives for Lifers. And he went back, kind of bringing back hope. So when he read this passage, abandon all hope, you who enter here, he said, I don't buy that. Is Dante really saying there's no hope? You can't enter a place like that. Everyone carries hope within them when they enter a place. Even when you go into a place where they say it's all over, you ain't never coming out of here, you can't buy that. What Dante really tells us is this: even though the place you enter has no hope and says so on the door, that we don't foster hope of any of that because it ain't in here, you have to bring hope in yourself. There's something inside you that says, yeah, we can come out of this. And that's representative of almost everyone who reads that passage in prison. Abandon all hope. They just don't accept it, and it's one of the things that brings them all together. And there was some question here. Yes.
Thank you so much for this lecture. There's something, I had a point related to the importance of hell. I guess this is a little point. I guess the empathetic experience that Dante has with the damned might be important for those suffering in prisons nowadays. But beyond that, what surprises the reader is that in hell, it's not surprising, but somehow it is, that there's the absence of God in hell. And a question I have is how much is the religious aspect of the Commedia important for those that are in prison and that read Dante or that listen to Dante's words?
I feel like the men and women in prison respond not necessarily to the Christianity that's at the base of the poem, but to the spirituality that's in the poem, because the men they're from all different religions who come together, but they respond to the spirituality, as do the students. And the discussions are really profound about religion and God. And the Yale students, who are mostly from the divinity school at Yale, say that their best conversations about religion happen in prison. So it's really spirituality that touches them and moves them. And I remember, actually, I'm thinking now of Patrick again, the Hells Angels, who actually wrote a piece about putting God on trial. And it was, I wish I had it here, but it was amazing when you put God on trial, and why do you, if God is just, then why did this happen to us? And it was extraordinary. And I actually want to read, I hope I can find this. I might not find it, but yeah, well, there's one passage that a woman wrote. She wrote a rap about her relationship with God, and she had written it before she read Dante, and it was almost exactly like something that Dante had written. Here it is. So when Dante is in this sphere of heaven, dedicated to justice. And he's essentially questioning God's justice. He said, and this is what inspired the man to put God on trial, because Dante is challenging God's justice. Dante says, actually, it's the eagle speaking to Dante and kind of reading his mind and saying, you would say that a man born on the shores of the Indus, where there's no one to speak or read or write about Christ, his life and words are without sin, but he dies without being baptized. Where's the justice that condemns him? And why is he at fault for not believing? Because in Christianity, if you're not baptized, you go to hell. And this is what the woman rap artist wrote. So if I praise God until I go numb and die and find out it was the wrong one, am I condemned because I was speaking in the wrong tongue? And when she read Dante, she realized she had already been writing what Dante wrote in her rap years before. But again, that's just one of the many examples of people responding to the spirituality in the poem.
I mean, there's something very religious about that, because even in the book of Psalms and Job, and I mean, it's always putting God on trial at the end of the day. So, yeah. Thank you.
Question? Are we done with questions? Way in the back. You were the first one here.
Okay.
We should let you have the last question.
So, through your endeavors with Dante, do you have anything like, have you ever encountered such a surprising or unexpected event or experience that you find memorable?
Yes, well, so many memorable things, but almost every line in Dante now that I read reminds me of a response that somebody in prison had to that line. But one of the ones that was most surprising to me was the response to Ugolino, who tells this story about his children dying when he was in prison. But as he's telling the story, he's eating the skull of a man who's in hell with him, that he blames for his incarceration. And so he's a cannibal as he's telling this story, and he makes himself sound good. And he says something like, if you don't cry when you hear my story, then whatever could possibly make you cry. And the way he tells the story and the language he uses is to me, when I first read it, was so overblown that I didn't believe him. I just didn't believe him. And when I told that to the men in, I think it was in McDougall Walker, they said to me, oh no, we believe him, because that's the way you have to talk if you want people to pay attention when you're in prison. In other words, as I said before, they're in a world where nobody listens to them. So they identified with Ugolino in prison, who had to speak that way if he wanted Dante to really listen to him. And me, of course, I didn't come from that background. I'm a professor. People listen to me. They write down what I say. But there, it's a completely different world. So I had to completely reverse my opinion of Ugolino based on somebody who shared Ugolino's experience of incarceration and really knew why you had to speak that way. Okay, so I think we're kind of towards the end. I'll just leave you with one paragraph written by a man in Florence from the Siliciano prison, happily after he was out, a few years after he was out of prison, and he reflected back on what it was like to read Dante in prison. He said, we created something useful in a place that was almost useless. From the belly of evil, we created something good. It was a miracle. For people who were closed up, who thought their life was finished, it was a success because nothing is finished. Abandon all hope is not true. Grab hold of every hope instead. Light every light you can light, because there's always light somewhere. All you have to do is light it and do something. Do anything to keep the light of hope shining so you can keep moving up towards heaven and look at the stars. Thank you.
Wow, what an amazing presentation. Thank you so much, Ron. This was so rich and so powerful. Thank you for coming and bringing the beautiful voices with you. That there's, you can look up, if you look up Ron's name online, Ronald Jenkins, you can find video of many of these performances, and they're really very beautiful. And I recommend that you do, because they really are, they're very powerful, and there's something there for all of us in terms of our understanding of justice and our understanding of Dante as well. I'd like to invite everybody to, if you enjoyed this evening and heard about the way that Dante affects people's lives. If you are not involved in Fordham Reads Dante, you are all welcome to join us. Our next meeting is going to be for Canto 27 on October the 30th, which is a Monday. We meet on Zoom. We started meeting on Zoom during COVID, and we've continued to do this because it allows people from all over the world to meet together and talk about Dante. And the meeting takes place in the middle of the day, 1 to 2:15. So we'll be meeting October 30th for Canto 27 and November 27th for Canto 28. So if you're interested in joining us, please feel free to email us, the Current Center, the cacs@fordham.edu, or you can email me and I'll make sure that you get the link to the Zoom link. So again, thanks so much for spending this hour and 15 minutes with us. And thanks again so much to Ron for presenting such a beautiful, beautiful work that you're doing.